I'm very excited to have David Frum here with your book, Trumpocracy. How about a nice round of applause for David? And I really, really was looking forward to reading your book. Ever since last year, I think it was the National Review had all the Never Trumps with all those essays. I don't know if you guys read that, but it was fascinating to me. Like, to me, it was like that showed me how scared everybody was that Trump was going to be president, you know. And now I think yours is probably the first in a wave of this type of, now the answer to some of that feeling. To me, it's almost like, I was talking to him earlier, I felt like it was like an episode of Quincy, like you're this coroner who's telling us how democracy died exactly, you know. And we're saying, we really ate that? Is that what we ate? As we look into the stomach. So tell me, what does Trumpocracy mean?
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Larry, thank you for agreeing to do this. Larry Wilmore this is a very un-Washington thing. He agreed to do the book before knowing that he was in the index. So that doesn't happen in my town. Trumpocracy is a description of the system of power of Donald Trump. I mean, he is the most mesmerizing TV presence of any politician of modern times. And we all are caught up in the drama of his oversized personality. But even when you're breaking norms and breaking democracy, you can't run America by yourself. Nobody can do that. Right. You're in a system of power. And that is the thing that the book tries to study, how he is enabled by his party in Congress, by the Republican donor institutions, by Republicans in the country. Maybe the way to visualize this is when you see Donald Trump at Camp David, he had an especially goofy moment at Camp David 2 weeks ago. And
a goofy moment?
This is a particularly goofy moment.
Right.
But over his shoulder, as he was raving, were 4 people on each side of him, sort of nodding quietly. And the book's about them.
Yeah. The people that drink the Kool-Aid. Trump has like the orange Kool-Aid that he's serving out to everybody. And the way that they drink it is amazing to me. And even when I look at what I thought conservatism was before Trump, I have no idea what it is now. Is he destroying the conservative movement, do you think? Is it stalling out? Is it changing? What's going on with it?
Well, he defeated it. He conquered it.
He defeated it.
He conquered it. He imposed himself on it. I mean, he begins by breaking Fox News. Remember, he boycotted a Fox debate. He forced Megyn Kelly out of Fox News. It's a series of assertions of power. And so there is a view of him that he's a doofus, that he's senile, that he's hapless. For everything that is properly part of the job of the president, that's true. But for everything that is not properly part of the job of the president, he is this powerful life force of where he bends people, including people who you think would resist. And so when you say those people, what's in it for them? Why do they drink the Kool-Aid? They begin by thinking they can control him, and they discover they are wrong.
Here's what I want to know, though. But do you think Trump is some like Machiavellian super genius that somehow has bamboozled everybody, or he stumbled his way into this? What is your take on it? How do you see that? Does he have some kind of game plan at work here?
So he's not a Machiavellian at all. He's not a planner. He's not an orderly mind.
He's not smart enough to be that evil, is what you're saying.
No.
That's what I'm saying.
You can be that evil, but it's by instinct. He has, if you've ever been bullied as a child, I mean, you know that the bully, whatever his other defects, he's got this instinct for what is the pain point in any individual human being. And Donald Trump can see that. He sees where the pain point is for people, for systems. He cannot abide any kind of a story. When Michael Flynn collapsed as National Security Advisor, there stepped into the breach a man named H.R. McMaster. He's one of the most honored American soldiers of his generation, a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, 3-star general, much decorated, also a considerable intellectual, author of an important history of civilian-military relations in the Vietnam War. And McMaster, who was in no way a Trumpist, signed up for this job out of a sense of duty. And he thought he would be able to manage Trump. His first project when he took over the job was to get Donald Trump to say words in defense of NATO. Trump had, through the campaign, denigrated NATO. He was going to get Trump to say it. They arranged a trip to NATO headquarters in Brussels in April. They arranged for Trump to give a speech in front of the monument to Article 5, a twisted girder from the World Trade Center, which had caused all the allies to rally to the United States. And McMaster dictated language to go into a speech that would affirm a commitment. And on the plane over to Brussels, McMaster briefed journalists that Trump would say these things and put all doubts to rest. And Trump got to the passage in the speech and skipped the key words, whether because he doesn't like NATO, or is beholden to Russia, or just doesn't like being told what to do. I don't know the answer to that. But I know what happened next, which is McMaster was put into a position in which, was he going to tell the Estonians and the Poles and the Bulgarians and the Romanians and the British and the Germans and the French and everyone who depends on the United States, I wrote in this language where we promised to protect you, and the president wouldn't read it? How can he say that?
Right.
He had to lie. And he said, because when the journalist asked him what went wrong, he had to say, I don't know what you're talking about. The president did exactly what we expected him to do. Good people in Trump's vicinity are compelled to do bad things, often for good reasons, because he takes the American state hostage.
Or bad things for bad reasons.
There are lots of those people too.
Yeah. I feel like he puts them all in a sunken place. So what happens? Do you think he did that on purpose, or do you think it was inadvertent? Because, look, Trump's relationship to NATO and those types of things is he's the slumlord. He thinks that America should be the slumlord of the world.
Yeah.
And his job is to collect the rent while demeaning them. Even though their gas is off, their lights are off, it doesn't matter. Pay the rent or you're going to get evicted. That's his relationship to the world for the United States.
Right.
Right?
Right. He has this power, desire to dominate.
Right? Yeah.
I don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out why he does things.
Okay.
Because I can't. How can I? But what I can show you is what he has done and what it means and why other people have gone along with it. And as you say, there are bad people who go along for their own bad reasons. I reproduce in the book a debate that I had with a man named Elliot Cohen, a very distinguished historian of American military power, and the question was, should people who care about national security serve in the Trump administration? And so I reproduced some of this stuff, but the key point at the end said, look, if you are going to be put into a position, inevitably, where the president will ask you to do something wrong, so you must know yourself, am I the kind of person who, when the president of the United States, with all the majesty of the office, asks me to do something wrong, am I confident that I will say no? And then the punchline is, if they were so confident, they wouldn't have asked you.
So that worries me. It seems like Trump has a lot of, there's a term microaggression, but I'm going to use it in a different way. I think there's a lot of little cuts that he's doing, a lot of little paper cuts. Some of it is directed at the press. Some of it is just directed on truth itself, where I believe he's slowly lowering the bar and lowering our resistance to even want to check the things he's saying are true. Where after a while, who knows the types of things he'll be able to get away with. And I think people might do those things that he's asking them to do because they won't even know what's true at some point.
There are a few master ideas that I'm trying to advance in the book. And one of them is, immediately after Donald Trump was elected, there was a lot of, from my point of view, loose talk about comparing this to dictatorial moments.
Right after the election?
Right after the election. People were startled. They hadn't seen, I hadn't. Some people had, but most people did not expect him to win. And so there's a lot of talk about, is this like the spectacular democratic breakdowns of the most horrible times of the past? And one of the ideas I try to argue against in the book is democracy is not on or off. It's a modern light switch, not a primitive one. It has a dial. It can go forward, it can go backwards. And you can reduce it without turning it all the way off. And I talk a lot in the book about other countries, but also periods in American history, like in the years after Reconstruction, when elections didn't vanish, courts didn't vanish. The federal courts, in fact, remained functional and quite reliable, but people lost the right to participate, and the participation lost its meaning. And institutions of the state broke away from popular control. And it's a much more a matter of more and less than yes and no.
Yeah, it seems like one of the more dangerous things that Trump is doing is it feels like he's telling people to don't believe in systems and don't believe in institutions, believe in me. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
Right.
Is that at the heart of Trumpocracy?
That's why the lies are so blatant, because they're tests. You know, just this morning, the president tweeted accurately that...
Wait, he tweeted this morning? Really?
He tweeted accurately that 46-point-something million people had watched his State of the Union address. And that was true, and he knew it was true because Fox and Friends reported that, and they're very good on...
then it must be true.
Right? Well, they're good on reporting ratings numbers. That's very, like, that. You don't fool around with that.
If it wasn't true, they wouldn't be Fox and Friends, you know.
And then he said, this is the biggest State of the Union audience in history.
Yeah.
And that's really not true.
Right.
So, but also highly checkable. Highly checkable.
Yeah.
So why do you tell that lie? Well, yes, there's a psychic need. I mean, he needs to be the biggest and the best. I mean, he lied about how many stories there are in Trump Tower.
Yeah.
He lies about how tall he is. Like he does that. But it's also, what he's doing here is every time he tells you there was a huge audience or I won this landslide victory, that he's setting the foundation so that other people around him who would flinch from a direct lie can say on television, well, this is what the American people voted for. This is what the country wants.
Yeah.
If you disagree with him, you are out of touch. That is, they don't repeat the claim that he's got a giant majority behind him, but they take it for granted. And it's false. It's not true. I mean, in fact, if you are a supporter of Donald Trump, it is you who are out of touch. But the stage has been set, and the lies serve that purpose, among other purposes.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. I've joked before where I always felt it was unfair to make an equivalency between Hillary and Trump as liars, because I always say, well, Hillary lies like a politician, but Trump lies like an alcoholic. You know? I mean, he does. True, you know? Or I revised it to say he lies like a crackhead, because it is more like a crackhead, because... It's true, because Trump doesn't... Look, politicians lie to gain power, to get votes, to hide something, whatever. Trump just lies, you know? I mean, he just needs the money for the VCR so he can buy his crack. That's really what he needs. And that crack is Trump itself, you know, the glorification of his name. You know, anything that, pumps helium into that seems like it's the truth for him. Like, I guarantee you, David, I guarantee you he can pass any lie detector test based on anything he said.
Well, do
you believe me or not? His conviction behind his lies are so amazing. I'm talking this way because I really have never seen anything like this, you guys. It really is unbelievable to me.
I cite in the book surveys that were done in the last month of the election, where they asked voters to rate the candidates on a variety of scales.
Yeah.
And the voters didn't like Trump. They thought on a question, care about people like me, Hillary would beat him. On a question of, temperament to be president, he would lose.
Yeah.
He won. He consistently in that last month outpolled Hillary on the question, who is more honest and truthful? So why? Why? Because one of the things in politics, if you look at a lot of polls, and what you have to understand is people don't always hear the question the way you think you heard the question.
Okay.
And so you have to, what are they hearing? So why did people find Trump so, people who didn't like him, who thought he didn't have the right temperament to be president, that he didn't care about them? And the answer is because the way Hillary Clinton and normal politicians deal with awkward truth is by equivocating. They know the truth is there,
right,
and they keep a distance from it. And they say they say things that allow them to walk through two doorways at the same time. So they do that because they have some awareness of truth and respect for it, and they don't want to outright contradict it. But when you hear equivocation, it sounds equivocal.
Yeah.
Donald Trump never equivocates. He is always direct. He is always forceful. It may be a total fiction, but it is unequivocal.
Donald Trump actually disagreed with himself once. He was calling himself a liar, and then we were the liars for not believing that he had been a liar. This was when, remember when he apologized for the grab him by the, for that comment, right? He apologized for it, and then a year later said, well, that wasn't even my voice. So he lied about him telling the truth, and then it was our lying ears that was the problem.
Right.
And yet people like him because of that. That's what you're telling me.
Well, people don't like him as much as this is where you get. People don't like him that much, and never have. I mean, look, 300.
You don't think he has a? There's a lot of people that actually.
There are
like
a lot.
him?
There are 330 million people in this country, and so 38% of that is a lot. But it's the secret of his power is it does not rest on vast majority approval. I mean, this is where this is the ocracy part of this. This is not like you're not dealing with a Hugo Chavez figure where there you are, someone trying to preserve a liberal democratic system, and there's this demagogue dictator, but who has somehow formed this connection with the great mass of people in your country. That's not what has happened here ever. There's never been a moment where we had a majority behind him. What there are systems of power that decisive minorities can use, and that is enough. And one of the things that also happens, and this is one of the things that is really ominous for the future, is a lot of the legitimation of Trump's rule is to say, at some level, look, it's true he doesn't have a majority exactly, but he has a majority of the proper Americans. And that gives him a legitimacy. And that is one of the things, and it's been, I'm a registered Republican, I'm a pretty conservative person, but one of the things that has been sort of a wrestle for me in this process is to understand the power of that idea that some Americans are not proper Americans and that their views are not legitimate.
Don't get me started on that, No, that's ridiculous, especially when they talk about coastal elites and they're not real Americans. But everybody that died in 9/11 was a real American. I think everybody agrees with that. And they're in New York
I think there's
City.
a carve-out for Staten Island.
Yes.
that doesn't count as being part of the coastal elite. That's okay.
Great New York joke. Any New Yorkers there? What's interesting about your book, it's a very thorough account of things that you forget about because the news cycle just grinds on so fast. Stories just replace stories so quickly. And it's nice to go back and remember some of the craziness of the things. And one of the things that struck me, and it's when you recall it, how Jeb Bush, was at the top, right? And in the amount of time it takes to cook microwave popcorn, right? Trump was number one. And that's fascinating. What is your observation of that? Did you have any sense of that at the time? Or?
No, well, it was 3 weeks. I mean, Trump declares in the middle of June, and by the end of the first week of July, he's in first place. And except for there's a short period in November when Ben Carson overtakes him.
Black Droopy the dog is what I call him.
And then that doesn't last.
Yeah.
And Trump is back in first place, and he's in first place all the way through. Look, when Trump appeared as a candidate, one other thing that needs to be said about this, and this is a thing that is forgotten, Trump put a toe in the water in 2012, and for about a week and a half was the Republican front runner in the 2012 cycle on the strength of the birther.
But no one took him seriously.
No one took him seriously, but in retrospect, that was obviously a mistake. That he had a connection. I mean, at that time, the Republicans have gone through these things where they cycle through these novelty candidates, the Michelle Bachmans, everybody gets a turn. And so what you thought was, well, they go through the novelty candidates and then they settle on on some governor or senator who's sort of what you expect. But Trump's success in 2012 was an indicator of what was to come. In 2015, when he first appeared, I have to say, my first reaction was, this could be, not him, it never occurred to me that he'd be the nominee, this could be a positive thing. He can shake things up. Because the party was gripped by this very ossified set of ideas, symbolized by Jeb Bush, a person I respect enormously as a human being, but he stood for pre-Great Recession Republicanism. And the Great Recession had happened. And
how would you define that very simply?
The belief that if you can get enough economic growth by deregulating the economy, that growth will suffice to pay for solutions to all your social problems.
That's exactly what they're talking about now. So how is it different than now?
What happened in the Great Recession, we learned first, I'm going to say here, this may sound like a little apology for my life, but so it is. So I apology not in the sense of I'm sorry, apology in the sense of defense. I graduated from college in 1982. Between 1982 and 2007, we had a quarter century in which there were two short, mild recessions. Quarter century in which there was almost no inflation. And if from the point of view of that quarter century, it was very reasonable to think we'd cracked the big problems. The people in the New Deal generation had solved the problem of how to fight depressions. The people in the Reagan-Thatcher years had solved the problem of how do you cope with inflation. Now it was called the Great Moderation, that we were going to have stable, steady economic growth. And thanks to the deregulatory reforms of the Reagan-Thatcher years, we had cracked the problem of how to run a modern economy in a steady way.
But during that time, I think the disparity of income was wider than it ever had been. I mean, more money was collected at the top and less money was available in the middle. And many of those manufacturing jobs, that happened during that period as well.
That's all true.
Right?
And so
I mean, you could describe the period before it as more of a moderate period, wouldn't you say?
Well, the period before it, I mean, moderate in that between...
Like, in other words, 1987, biggest stock market crash since the Great Depression. You know, right after a period of tax cuts and growth. That had not happened since then.
But it didn't affect the real economy. That was that 1987 is the test case. You have this horrific stock market crash.
But it was after the deregulation of savings and loans.
Yeah, but the economy continues to grow. There's no recession after.
There was a recession in the early 90s.
There's a recession 3 years later.
Right.
But stock market crashes. I remember it. Well, you're too young, but
I remember.
but we were expecting a 19. That was 29. Where's 1930? And 1930 didn't show up. So when I call it the Great Moderation, I just meant that's a period in which, if you look at the chart of what it's much more like little ups and downs than big ones.
Well, and the United States economy, to be fair, has done this. If you chart it from in the 20th century, it's pretty much a straight line with some dips.
Right. So the dips got. Okay. So we thought we had solved this problem. So then comes the Great Recession, and suddenly
you're talking about 2008.
2008, okay. And suddenly you realize all of these problems that I associated with our grandparents and great-grandparents, they had not been solved forever. They were just waiting around the corner. And so you had to a lot of things it seemed to me, had to be rethought. And then when you look backwards from that prism...
Like what? What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the big ideas of the conservatism of the George W. Bush era, I served in the George W. Bush administration, I was a supporter of his, was what we could do was Social Security had gotten out of date. And you needed to give people more control over it. You needed to give them some kind of private account. They would have more ownership. The money would be invested in the stock market. It would grow faster. It would be more stable. And that looked like, on the basis of the experience of 1982 to 2007, that looked like a very promising idea. From the point of view of 2009, it didn't look so good.
Right.
And so you were reminded why.
Right.
G.K. Chesterton, who's a great sort of Catholic conservative religious thinker, has this wonderful line in one of his essays: "Never tear down a fence until you know why it was put up in the first place." And so we had to confront, why was Social Security there? What was it there to do? But the Republican field of...
And Social Security was roundly attacked by conservatives when it first came out, and also years later in the 60s when the debate over Medicare happened.
For sure.
As a socialist takeover of government, this is un-American, it's never going to be the same, and it's still here. And now conservatives want to save it.
But you would hear people like Jeb Bush and others talk in 2015, 2016, as if the experience of the past 10 years had not happened. And what that did to them politically was that Bush and Marco Rubio and others would talk about, all hope and growth and opportunity and the best America is yet to come. And meanwhile, the Republican voting base, which was increasingly white, increasingly non-college, increasingly non-urban, increasingly in the middle of the country, was saying, what are you talking about? We do not see hope. What we see is life expectancy is going down, something that did not happen during the Great Depression in the United States. We see an epidemic of drug addiction that in the 3 years leading up to the 2016 election killed more people than died, killed more Americans than died in the Vietnam War. We don't see hope, and we don't know what you're talking about. You know, Donald Trump, when he gave his first speech, aside from, you know, the line that didn't get enough attention, everyone remembers, the Mexico doesn't send its best. But he said in that speech, the American dream is dead. And what you were always taught in Republican politics is you talk that way and you're finished. The American people want happy candidates. They want optimistic candidates. They want Reagan 2.0. The race is, this is a rule. The race is always won, or the debate is always won by the candidate who projects the most optimism. Donald Trump was the most pessimistic candidate, and he saw off the Rubios and the Bushes because he was connecting to something real. And my reaction to all that was, okay, we need to hear this guy, because I saw what he was seeing. And what I thought is, if he talks this way, he will shake up the field, force a modernization of Republican ideas, and then some more responsible actor will steal his lines. What I didn't count on was that that Donald Trump would move into first place, and nobody would adjust at all.
See, I see it a little differently. I see I feel he used a lot of racial resentment and cultural resentment, first from the birther movement, which, you know, that started the energy around his campaign, as you pointed out as well. But there's a lot of cultural resentment as well, which is embodied by Obama. But there was no difference from his speech, tone-wise, than Richard Nixon's speech in 1968, when he pretty much lobbied the same accusation of people that were against the Vietnam War. And Make America Great Again is exactly what Ronald Reagan said in 1980. He also said, Make America Great Again. So he also came out with the pessimistic view. So these games, he actually has done these same things that have been done before. It's just in a horrible package. Like it's all put together. The way it's so blatant. Let me put it a different way.
Yeah.
Nixon, say what you want about him, was a trained politician.
Yes.
You know, a very talented politician, was a statesman, all those types of things. Very intelligent man. Ronald Reagan had so much charisma, was the governor of California, you know, and he actually had a vision for what he wanted to do. He was one of the leaders of that new conservative movement. Donald Trump doesn't have an ideology. You know, he really is a narcissistic, sociopathic, like orange blob.
Well, I don't want to.
That is but is amazingly charismatic, but I think he's carrying the message that gave him that power.
Well, I don't want to wander too far down these byways, but I'm going to say a word here in defense of Richard Nixon, because this happened a lot. Well, we're in his home, a little down the road, but this happened a lot. Steve Bannon used this line. He said that Donald Trump's convention speech will be based on the Nixon convention speech in 1968. And so I was in the hall for that speech, and I was startled by it, and I went back and reread the Nixon speech.
Yeah.
And it's not like that at all. Richard Nixon in 1968 at the convention was an almost perfectly balanced speech, where between different themes, nodding to the right and nodding to the left. So one of the most memorable lines from Richard Nixon's speech, he was talking about this is a time of rising crime, urban riots, a lot of upheaval just after the double assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And Nixon, he had a balanced paragraph in which he said, it can be no justice without order, and no order without justice. And then there's a paragraph about enforcing order, and then there's a paragraph about racial equality. And it's bing, 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 all through the body of that speech. Now, maybe you say at other times and in other places there were other subtexts. But when Nixon was in formal mode, unlike Donald Trump, it was nod to the left, nod to the right, because he was a real politician, and because he knew he was going to be president, and he was going to have to actually govern this country. And he had a strong sense, because he belonged to that post-war generation, which the Democrats had been so dominant, that he was the leader of the weaker of the two parties, and therefore needed to be more careful.
Yes, but my observation is that Nixon didn't mind riding on the backs of racial resentment and cultural resentment, because both of those were in the air in a very pungent way in 1968.
For sure,
I mean,
but he
black
thought he
people
could.
were blamed for the riots, even though Martin Luther King, was slain that year. That's why those riots started. The Watts riots a couple of years earlier. I think it may have been after Malcolm X was killed.
Yeah.
But
Nixon thought he could master those forces and use them and ride them. He
the
thought
Democratic Party was falling apart at that time too.
he thought he would be
did
in
take
charge.
advantage of that, right?
And Trump does not. Trump doesn't have that kind of purpose. So, and one of the things that I want to emphasize in this book is that I do talk about the non-uniqueness of Trump. I mean, the United States political system has been like a man falling down stairs for a while, and a lot of the, because like one of the things, I mean, I do have a kind of a pessimistic outlook. I'll plead guilty to that, and but people say, well, you 5 years ago you said things were bad. And I said, well, that's true. When you fall down stairs, each stair is a new low. That doesn't mean they're going to run out of stairs.
Yeah. Damn you, gravity. What do you think? How much do you think a good economy affects people's acceptance of Trumpocracy?
That's a very important question. I think that one of the big stories of 2018 is going to be the president's increasing strength.
Yeah. I agree with you on that. I do.
His numbers have gone up. Actually, his numbers have gone up since December. I mean, they're still bad, but the number, what is his net? If you look at his net disapproval, that is the people who like him minus. Well, you have to do it the other way around. You get a negative number. He's still got a negative approval rating.
I find those numbers irrelevant.
But,
to me, the electoral numbers are the only numbers that matter.
Okay. Well, he is getting stronger, and what is at the same time as his party in Congress is getting weaker. And so he is becoming more important to the Republican Party as a whole, and they're being put into a position in which many of them have to face this possibility that after November of 2018, he may be the last protector of Republican interests in Washington. And it will be especially important at that point to defend him. So he's cannibalizing or devouring the party from the inside and replacing it, and is making himself the future. The idea that he's going to go away, I want to argue against the idea that he's going to go away on his own or collapse of his own.
Oh, that's not going to happen. Absolutely not. Do you think that's going to happen? Why do people think Trump would quit? Of all the people who want the attention, like Trump would be the last person that would walk away. Do you think there's that there was any Russian collusion in the, direct Trump-Russian collusion? I'm not a big conspiracy person. I'm of the belief that I don't think there was any direct collusion, is my belief, in the way that people think that there was a quid pro quo type of thing.
Well, let's go through what we know and what we don't know. We know that Russia has interfered with elections through the democratic world since at least 2014. In some cases, very blatant. Like in France, they actually made literally loans to the National Front. They did that in the Czech Republic. They made loans to the party, the pro-Russian party, and elected, and then now have re-elected the president of the Czech Republic.
And with technology, it just gets easier and easier.
And here in the United States, this game of piercing email systems and getting information, they've done that. They've done that in Poland. They've done that in a lot of places. So it's a fact that the Russians got Democratic Party emails.
Definitely. Right.
They also got Republican Party emails, but they never used those.
Right.
It's a fact that through WikiLeaks, which is more or less a Russian cutout, and increasingly a Russian cutout, they published those, and they distributed them in ways and times to do as much damage to the Democratic Party candidate and as much help to the Republicans as possible. They did this at the congressional as well as the presidential level. So those are just on the record.
Right.
We know that
there was direct communication with someone from WikiLeaks and some of these people.
Roger Stone.
Roger Stone, definitely.
Would very accurately say 2 and 3 days before WikiLeaks dumped that one is coming. We know that they reached out to the Trump family, and that Donald Trump, in writing an email, enthusiastically accepted a meeting to discuss negative information about Hillary Clinton.
Adoptions.
So adoptions means what we want is
I'm adopting your policy, Mr. Putin.
We want you to drop end the Magnitsky Act sanctions. So the great mystery. So those, I mean, that already you have the makings of one of the biggest scandals in American history. The great mystery, the thing that is not known, is to what extent did the Trump people communicate back to Russia? The Russian Facebook ads, which were seen by more people than who cast a ballot, those ads were very intelligently placed. Now, maybe they figured it out on their own. It's not that hard. But maybe somebody gave them some guidance.
Yeah, if our aunts and uncles can figure that out and spread these things right, it's almost too easy for someone to tamper with our elections, it seems, especially after this last one.
It's pretty easy, and nothing has been done. And this is one of the really amazing things about the events of the past week. The head of the CIA said the Russians are going to try again, and nothing is being done.
The Republicans aren't interested in this.
The congressional Republicans.
Which is shocking. This is so different from any Republican behavior in the history of Republicanism, probably up to this moment.
For me, this has been a real make or break issue because I'm a foreign policy hawk. I believe in an American-led world order, and I've been following with horror the breaking of our hopes for a better Russia in the 1990s and the emergence of Putin.
What is well? How does the Republican Party square itself with that position that they're taking?
Well,
I mean, is the leadership going to break down? Are we going to see people like McConnell and those people just going away? Or are they going to be replaced by a new party?
I think we're heading for a period of real political convulsion. And I don't want to end this conversation without talking about the many reasons there are for real hope.
Talk about whatever you want.
But before we get to the real hope, I have to go with the natural bent of my mind. Is for the reasons to be ominous. I think we are heading to a much more immediate crisis because the evidence is going to be bad. Whatever what we know already is bad, and there may be things coming that are worse. The predicates are being set. That's what this Nunes brochure or scribble or whatever it is. I'm
feeling, just for the people listening, we're recording this like hours before. Like I think it's going to be released tomorrow. This memo.
Yes.
I have a feeling it's going to be like on disappearing ink. Like we'll be able to see it for like 10 hours or something.
It's
not gone.
It's not meant to impress anybody who knows anything.
The Republicans are backing away from this, by the way. It seems like, have you noticed this in the last, in the last, well, it's probably not, people shouldn't make such a big deal out of what they're going to say.
It's just an effort to create a justification for ignoring what the FBI is finding. But here's what we're setting up, and here's the thing I worry is coming. When the Trump people say collusion is not a crime, as increasingly they do, they are not wrong. I mean, it is a crime to hack communications. That's criminal. And there are a whole lot of election laws governing receiving things of value from foreign parties. And there are all kinds of foreign registration laws. There are a series of technical statutes that people around Trump may have tripped over. But the core offense of come into my office, Mr. KGB man, FSB man, and let's talk about how we can work together to elect me. I've put this question to lots and lots of people who served in very important legal positions in the U.S. government. How is that illegal? And the answer most of them come to is that if they don't trip over these technical statutes about foreign registration and election law, it's not illegal. Of course, you can do that. I mean, no one ever would. No one ever did. It's shocking. It's unpatriotic. It's un-American. It's anti-democratic. But it's not illegal. So
it sounds like a very OJ defense team rationalization.
But here's where we may be. So it may be that in some months, Special Counsel Mueller reports that he's indicted a bunch of people for these technical violations of election law statutes and other things. But he stopped at a certain level, and then maybe he gives a report about what happens. And the report says what happens, and he says, but I don't find prosecutable offenses here. And at that point, we have a gigantic national political, it's a political matter, you may say. At that point, you have a national political convulsion about is this acceptable or not. And there will be people who say, well, no laws were broken, so yes, it may be unfortunate, it may be irregular. Britt Hume had some version of this. And it may be unfortunate or inappropriate, but if it's not illegal, what's the issue? And that sets the way for a particularly vicious political battle.
So they're pretty much making it the Stormy Daniels of issues. Like, well, it wasn't illegal sleeping with a porn star.
Right.
And nobody cares about morality anymore, so what's the point? You know, do you think this whole memo thing is just a big distraction? Like, is Trump a Manchurian candidate?
Yeah.
Is there something else going on that we can't see? I always feel like these things are distractions. Like there's some action that's happening that this thing is distracting us from.
Well, the action that happens all the time is the flow of money. I mean, Donald Trump right now he's operating an active business as president of the United States.
Yeah, you talk about this in the book as well, yeah.
Lyndon
really is blatant, too.
It's really blatant.
Yeah.
And he's receiving, and his business, unlike Lyndon Johnson, continued to run his radio stations in Texas while he was president, and he shouldn't have done that.
But come on, you'd love to have Lyndon Johnson do a radio show. That would be fantastic.
I think it was a top 40 format.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything interesting.
Right.
But Trump has an international business. His business is licensing his name to. I mean, Trump was a big deal in New York in the 80s, and then his company went bust, and he said, well, I can't be big in New York, but I'll be big in Baku. And in Azerbaijan and the UAE and India and any place where they like a lot of gilding on their palaces.
Right. Gold is their jam.
Right. Yeah, he's like the restoration hardware of Baku.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And he has towers there and business partners, and they write him checks. He gets a check from the Philippines. He gets a check from Turkey. He gets a check from the United Arab Emirates. He gets a check from India. And those, I mean, not from the governments of those countries, from business partners, but they in turn are subject to pressure from their governments. And none of this, we don't know how much. We don't know if it's a dollar amount or a percentage amount. We don't know how important it is to his income. Is it 5% or 10 or 30 or 60? That's the thing that he has his eye on, I think, every day at work.
And do you think, so is that Trump's ultimate thing, is to increase like his holdings and his name and that sort of thing to get as much money out of this as possible? Or do you think it is to dismantle, I mean, you talk about almost the dismantling of governance itself with, part of Trumpocracy is that theory, right?
I don't think he cares enough about government to set out to dismantle it as an end in itself.
Right.
But there are all these, the United States government is set up to catch somebody like this, to keep him out of power and to prevent these commercial activities. So in self-preservation, he has to shut down the U.S. government, because if it continues to activate, sooner or later it will discern his activities, discover his activities, and he will be in some kind of trouble. So he's turning off the burglar alarms, and out of his pure desire for dominance, he cannot accept any restraint on his power, even when it's not directly, even when the smarter thing may be to sort of smooth it over rather than to confront it.
When you say those things, it's hard to imagine that he could even spend another hour in the White House, and it's just accepted. Like Ronald Reagan was called the Teflon president. Remember, they said if Reagan went through a car wash with the top down, Jimmy Carter would get wet, right? that was the joke, right? That was about Reagan. But with me, like with Trump, to me, is like Terminator 2. You know, I mean, anything that would completely destroy anyone else, for him, just that liquid orange alloy just reforms, and he's like, okay, and nobody cares. Why is it? How does that happen? How come no one actually cares? Like this whole Stormy Daniels thing, I made a joke about it.
Yeah.
But that would could you imagine if that had happened to Obama? Right? I mean, I can't imagine that he would be unaffected by it, his presidency.
What if Obama did it twice a day in different ways and did it for a year?
What, be with the porn star?
The thing is, what Trump does is...
it's the volume.
It's the volume. I mean, one of the questions I get asked about the book is there anything new in it? And my answer is it will seem new.
Yeah. Right.
Because you've forgotten it.
Your book should only be on Kindle so it can be updated every time you read it. I don't remember this chapter. Where did this come from? So people just don't care at the end of the day?
They're exhausted. Look, a lot of people care. You all care, right?
Yeah.
But you're
exhausted,
you're
though,
exhausted,
too, right? It
and-
is exhausting, yeah.
And you're a little disheartened. So here, I want to talk here maybe a little bit about why you should not be like me, and you should not let pessimism. Or as I said, the motto I use is you should think like a pessimist, but act like an optimist.
Okay.
And here what is going on is I think people do care.
Okay.
And one of the things that is very striking is 2014 had the lowest voter turnout of any election since 1942, when millions of American young men were overseas. 2016, very listless, unemotional election that where a lot of the real emotional energy of the Democratic Party seemed to be turning on its own candidate. And on the Republican side, there was a kind of resignation to Trump, lesser evil. It was a low emotion election. But 2017 was a high emotion year, and you saw, something I worried about at the beginning, destructive emotion, a lot of 1960s style protests, but the most legal, orderly, and patriotic protests I think you've ever seen. I mean, the first Women's March in Washington in January 2017, there was not a single arrest. When the police said, "Don't walk on the flower beds," they didn't walk on the flower beds. And that's not to everybody's taste, but it's the way to do it. And what you see is this, along with the level of civil engagement, this level of demand for knowledge. Everyone who is in my line of work in the media feels your readers are not only reading you more, but they're reading you differently. They're reading you, it's not just, elegant gossip about Washington, that people feel a sense of urgency about it. I think you see sort of, Trump has given us, there are some gifts to him, a wider vision. The opioid crisis really was not seen in 2015. It was barely seen.
As a political issue, you mean?
Well, I do a survey in the book where I said, punch into the New York Times, the thing that allows you to search for words. I did for the calendar year 2016. I entered the word opioid and the word transgender. And I don't want to belittle anything that anybody's going through, but it is striking that there were 6 times as many mentions of transgender issues in the New York Times in 2016 as there were of the opioid crisis that was claiming tens of thousands of lives. So it wasn't just the political elite didn't see it, because the social elite didn't see it, because it wasn't touching us. So I think that Trump has given us a wider vision. He's done something else that I think is really important. The phrase post-truth began as a compliment. It begins in the academy, begins among advanced kinds of philosophers who want to say that truth is a construct, there is not one truth. We don't want to impose one person's truth on another. Different people have different experiences and therefore different truths. And we should replace the concept of truth with the concept of truths. Oprah paid homage to this in her speech at the Golden Globes when she referred to your truth and your truth. I think one of the things that Donald Trump has shown us is the opposite of truth is not truths, the opposite of truth is lying. And democracy can't take it, because you rely, here you are, 3,000 miles from Washington, you rely on flows of information to know how do I cast my vote in line with my interests and my values. And if you're systematically deceived, your vote becomes useless. And he's confronted us with both the fragility and the preciousness of truth.
I just slightly have a disagreement, because I think politicians have always lied, but I think people knew what the game was. They knew the type of lie. Caesar was stabbed on the Senate floor. Politicians have always there's always been darkness around, But do you think, let me ask you this question, and it's interesting because when you brought up transgender and opioid crisis, and I think part of what's happening in the country, my observation on this is somehow those are, and I know this was not your intention, but somehow those are put up against each other as if they're in competition, or as if one has anything to do with the other, as if they should be pitted against each other in some kind of.
I just mean, what do we see and what
but
do we not see?
But it's some type of cultural competition, and I think that's what's going on out there right now. This kind of people holding on to what they think the culture is and using things to vote against, even more so than a vote for, it seems like.
But the decline in life expectancy that has affected the non-college part of the population. That's something it's hard I mean, you know, for the parts of America that are working, people are living longer and healthier. I mean, look at the Democratic primary field, whose motto seems to be 90 is the new 70. It's just, I mean, really, the idea that you have 75-year-olds thinking, yeah, 3 years I may run for president.
Yeah.
And that's an enormous blessing. But meanwhile, there are huge parts of America where people are living less long than they did 20 years ago. And that, it just has to be stressed, that has never happened in peacetime in any developed country. It didn't happen here during the Great Depression. It didn't happen in Germany when people were starving during the Great Depression. It didn't happen there. I mean, the only places it's happened are in non-college America and in the post-Soviet republics.
What do you think is the biggest cause? Can you blame it on technology?
The phrase that is used is deaths of despair. Drugs, obesity, but things like Americans have the lowest seatbelt use of any developed country.
Well, all that fat, you know, it's kind of... I'm not fat shaming you guys. I'm talking about driving. I'm driving shaming.
The gun accidents, you know, that you read about these stories, and there's somehow that...
some of those aren't accidents.
But, you know, there's something, I mean, I don't want to, like, again, as you don't compare, but there's something kind of made extra horrifying about the story of people who are playing with weapons and kill their children because they're not attached enough to life to put the thing away. And all of those things, accidents of all kinds, the way the eating, the drinking, the drugs, the seatbelts, it all adds up to people who are not. I mean, all the things that I'm sure every person in this room does because you have a vision of a future. The tomorrow is going to be better. There are people you love. There's a reason to be here. And then we also have this, you know, problem of a country in which more and more people live alone, and in which, you know, when you ask questions like, I feel I have a lot of close friends, non-college Americans are just on a toboggan slide where every year fewer and fewer of them report having close friends. And the number of Americans who get through, again, there are surveys on this, who say, did you leave your house in the last 12 hours? We're a rising trend of Americans who say, I've never left my house. And okay, and some of them are teenagers who are like wrapped up in Call of Duty. But a lot of them are people who, because of some kind of physical impairment or depression, and there's just more of this. And it's killing people.
Yeah, the physical health and the mental health is really a huge problem. I know you don't want to end on that down note before we take questions. Give me some hope. Give me that hope.
Okay, the hope starts in this room. The hope starts with the fact that you're here. Everyone has more options as to how to use time than any human beings have ever had. And the rise in civic mindedness. I think there is hope. I think we are also seeing some of the excesses of American life being tampered a little bit. I mean, I strongly suspect that if I were in this hall 4 years ago and tried to persuade you that Julian Assange and Edward Snowden were not heroes, I would not get a very hospitable hearing. But I think people can see that now. And I think there are people and if I were in Germany or France 4 years ago and I talked about what happens if America recedes from world leadership, I don't know that I would always get a hospitable hearing. But if you talk to them about it now and they have to confront what that world looks like, you get a different hearing. And on the political right, I think one of the things that sort of this part of the psychology of the political right is we're very quick to accept the unfairnesses of life as just the ordinary bumps in the road. You know, life. Who said life is fair? And what Trump does is he takes all of those petty cruelties that it's not a big deal, the microaggressions, and he magnifies them into one big 24-hour-long tweeted macroaggression, and he says, "Look at this. How do you feel about it?" And I don't want to be overly idealistic with this. I mean, the Romans built the Colosseum and kept it filled twice a week, every day for 400 years, by offering people the spectacle of men hacking each other to death, and it sold out. I mean, there is a huge human appetite for cruelty. but there is also a human revulsion from cruelty and confronting it. And I think we are seeing a lot of that, just the confrontation. And this is, I think this is one of the reasons why the reaction to Trump has been led by women, that they see the cruelty, they see it faster, and they hate it more.
Although a majority of women voted for Trump. And black women say vote. They're white women.
The majority of white women voted for Trump.
Okay, let's take some of your questions for Debbie.
All right, it's time for questions. Just a quick reminder that around here, questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question, and only Larry Wilmore gets to ask follow-up questions.
I didn't know where that voice was coming from. Like, is somebody like slow playing a question?
Good evening. A short-term crisis question about Rosenstein and what's going on with this memo. Could he be fired over the weekend and Trump do something like a recess appointment because they're out?
Good question.
Is that a concern?
Is that his evil plan?
I am so concerned about that. I share your, that does look like a very plausible scenario. And is this on? That looks like a very plausible scenario, something really, really to worry about. And this would be a good time for him to do it from his point of view, because his party, the point of the memo is to unite his party, to give it a plausibility where that it might not have had 6 months ago. And as they get closer to the election, they might get panicky.
Yes, who's next? Over here?
Thanks. In some of your writing, you once said a lot of what's going on in the Tea Party or with Trump, it's almost like a going out of business sale for the baby boomers.
Yes.
And
for the baby boomers?
Yes,
Oh,
and as
great.
a millennial, can you elaborate what you meant by that and what's that going to mean for my generation?
So, thank you for your good memory. Here's what I meant by that. That the Tea Party of 2009 was often described by journalists as a reaction against debts and deficits. But when you saw it close up, it was a movement in defense of Medicare. And when you combine that with what the polls showed you about the attitudes of people then in their 60s, that what you saw was they were involving a new kind of conservatism that insisted that on the total defense of Medicare, that said that America was not doing enough to protect the interests of older people. But at the same time, they're willing to do almost anything to all the rest of the activities of the state in order to protect their program. And so I was struck by how do you explain what was happening to the politics of the boomers who, in those years immediately after the recession struck, became very much more conservative. They convert the politics of the people who were born in the 15 years after World War II converged on to that point, much more conservative politics of the people born between 1930 and 1945. And so what it looked to me what they were doing was they were coming up with a politics of generational self-defense. Protect our programs at the expense of the future. And as I said, this isn't conservatism, it's a going out of business sale for the baby boom generation.
Great.
Hi, I'm one of your, it's over to your right.
Okay.
I'm one of the people who is reading you more and reading everyone more and soaking it up. But given that your book is not an endorsement of Trump and it's a kind of a cautionary tale, and that his supporters, you say, are out of touch, and the democracy dimmer is going down, why is it important to have us read you? And aren't you frustrated as a writer about not getting the message across to the people who need that message most, who aren't being served by Trumpocracy?
Is it a preaching to the choir?
Probably tonight, yes. But I was in Louisville, Kentucky yesterday talking to actually a bigger audience than tonight. And no disrespect.
I have so many Kentucky jokes I can do right now.
But here's there's a lot of focus on this fabled Trump base.
And the question is often asked, what would it take to change the minds of the Trump base? But politicians don't lose by losing their base. That's why it's called the base. They lose because, and things change because the next layer are peeled away, and the layer after that. And so what I hope I'm doing is talking to, just before the election, this is a sort of tale of the school, we had we had a little gathering at my house, and I was talking to some friends who were there was one very prophetic friend who even more pessimistic than me, who was saying, that's it, Trump's going to win. And I was assuring him, and my wife constantly reminds me of this, no, all those women in the Philadelphia suburbs who own cookware with French words on them, they're going to save you. And they didn't in 2016, but they are the soft Republicans, the people who voted for Mitt Romney and had trouble with Trump. That's where it comes away. I tell the story in the book of what happened in the state of Pennsylvania in 2016. There were 2 statewide elections that year, one for president, one for U.S. senator. The U.S. senator was an incumbent, a man named Pat Toomey, very conventional Republican of the Paul Ryan type, past president of the Club for Growth. Both Trump and Toomey got almost exactly the same number of votes, about 1.2 million. But Toomey ran 200,000 votes ahead of Trump in the Philadelphia suburbs and 200,000 votes behind him in the rest of the state. So what you can see there is that there are 2 Republican parties that substantially overlap, but that also substantially diverge. And places like those Philadelphia suburbs, where the people voted for Toomey and not for Trump, if a few tens of thousands more people had made that same decision, the politics of the United States would look very different. And that can still happen in the future. Everything that we're talking about is a future that is in our hands. The future is not something to predict, because the future, you can only predict the future if the future already exists and you can see it. It doesn't. The future is the product of people's choices.
But David, I'll go back to the point I was making earlier. Because you're talking about Pennsylvania, to go back to the Kentucky, right? But if the economy is doing better and people aren't watching the news every day and keeping up with all these things, these horrible things, whatever that Trump is doing, which is more becoming just cult of personality, and people, as we say, are getting exhausted by it. But if the economy is doing well, as the Clintons said, is the economy stupid, and they're judging by their pocketbooks, is any of this going to matter?
Everything can matter. And then this is where people in this room do become very, very important to the politics of the future, because elections are always about choices in a 2-party system, and so long as the United States has an electoral college and a first-past-the-post system for Congress, it will be a 2-party system. Everything is a matter of more or less, and a lot of what happens in the future depend on the choices that Democrats make, and there has been a tendency for Democrats who are disappointed by the pace of change in the Obama years to pursue messianic candidates. They have made choices that make them more excited but less electable. And the future shape of your party, or the party I assume that most of the people in the room probably sympathize with, whether it makes responsible choices or emotional choices, is going to determine a lot of the shape of the future. And that's a heavy responsibility. This government shutdown that happened, I think the Democrats just walked into a trap on this. I think the Republicans completely won this one. The Democrats shut down the government, which is always a foolish thing to do, and a wrong thing to do, by the way. It's just not the way the game should be played. But they shut it down over 2 issues: Children's Health Insurance Program and the status of the DACA population. The people came to the country illegally as minors and who are now adults.
Yeah, you're in California. You don't have to explain DACA.
So here's what. So
this ain't Kentucky. Yeah.
All right. Don't want to take anything for granted, but all right, thank you. So 2 issues. The Republicans almost instantly yielded on the first, taking that issue off the table. And so the shutdown, and it happened on a weekend, so there was not a lot of chance for the Democrats to change their footing. The result was that the Democrats were seen to shut down the government over the status of a population who were in the country illegally. And that is exactly the image that Republicans wanted to affect Senate contests in red states. That they had a very clear goal: lure lure Claire McCaskill into something that is going to
Yeah,
doom
very
her.
cynical game, right?
It was a cynical game. But you know what? When somebody lays a trap for you, you don't have to walk in.
Who's next?
All right, time for two more questions.
Two more, but there's so many people with
Over
questions.
here. So, David,
Okay.
you've written really articulately about Trump as an authoritarian personality. The rest of the world has had authoritarian rule, Western Europe, Asia, Africa, South America. It's never happened in America. There's never been a successful authoritarian
Yeah.
character. We've had near misses during the Great Depression with Huey P. Long in the 50s with Joe McCarthy. So my question is, why now? Is it something unique to Trump and his media propaganda mastery? Is it something about the sense of despair in the country? Is it something about the weakness in ineffectualness of his opponents, both in the Republican Party and the eventual Democratic candidate? Where do you think it came from?
I think that at the deepest level, here's the cause. I cite in the book a study by a German political scientist named Yascha Mounk, who asked this question to people in half a dozen or a dozen different developed countries. Is it essential to live in a democracy? If you ask that question to people who were born in the 1930s, in the United States, and Sweden, and Germany, and Britain, and Canada, about 90% say yes, it is essential to live in a democracy. The number who answer that question, yes, it is essential, declines with every 10-year cohort. And among people who are under 30, about 25% say, yes, it is essential.
Do they understand the question?
Well, that's a great point. That's
Yeah.
a great point. Maybe they don't understand the question. So to back it up, Monk gave them some alternatives. Would you like to see a strong leader who can cut through red tape and ordinary laws? Would you favor rule by the army instead of by politicians? And again, among people under 30, it's a minority who say yes, but it is a significant minority. Whereas among people who are older, it is an insignificant minority. So something is happening where there is over time a progressive loss of faith in the democratic idea. That's the backdrop.
Do you think part of it has to do, Bush, Obama, and now Trump have all kind of, while we've been sleeping, used executive action, and with the complicity of Congress too, with their non-ability to work together, almost forcing this action in some ways, where we've handed over a lot of control to the executive
I
branch.
think there's a lot to that, but I think when you have a phenomenon,
Where when they do something we like, we just don't care, is what I'm saying.
but when you have a phenomenon that is as true in Sweden as in the United States, you can't have an America-only explanation. Something bigger is going on across the democratic world. And I think that something is, first, the fading of the memories of the war, that you can imagine that the alternative to democratic rule is fill in your charismatic hero here,
Right.
rather than oppression and conflict. And I think it's the fact that after the war, democracy not only delivered freedom, but it delivered the goods. You didn't just get to live in freedom and dignity, you also got a refrigerator and a car and paid holiday, and that seemed pretty good. When democracy stops delivering the goods, a lot of people say, well, I appreciate the freedom and dignity, but that's a good
And the
start.
refrigerator, thank
But
you
where's
very
my
much.
refrigerator or the my robot espresso maker? So I think there's something big going on throughout the world. And one of the things I think we talked about what can we do, because that's a question. One of the things I think we all need to develop is a new appreciation for the value of moderate, slow, incremental change. And I quote here a person of the left, the great American socialist Eugene Victor Debs, who said, who was a hugely charismatic figure with a huge following, but he said once to a gathering of people who were just hanging on his every word, "I would not lead you to the promised land even if I could, because if I could lead you in, someone else could lead you out."
I don't know how Moses would take that.
And that brings us to our final question for the evening.
Here, straight ahead of you, David.
Thank you.
You're sitting in Santa Monica, the hometown of Stephen Miller. How is this hometown boy of ours screwing our nation so severely with this, old man? What the heck is going on?
He seems very popular in Santa Monica.
Look, I don't want to traffic in personalities because you never know. You never know. But what I would say to those of you who are in Santa Monica now is whatever who knows what motivates any human being, but you can know what motivates you, and you can know the kind of politics that you want to live by. And I think that the challenge for all of us is to be fuller citizens. I mean, in many ways, Donald Trump and his counterparts across the developed world are judgments on us for not being committed enough, optimistic enough citizens, not having enough of a spirit of give and take. And so I think whatever you think of Stephen Miller, he is speaking for something that is real in this country. And it's something that you need to take into account. And I think Americans have played this game of politics since the year 2000 with increasing ruthlessness. That's the first chapter of the book. I describe how the game has just gotten rougher and rougher and rougher. And a lot of things that, well, it was theoretically possible to do that just didn't happen in the past, they began to happen. And each party would do them, and then it would justify an even more severe reaction by the next, in a kind of death spiral of revenge. That's what we have to break out of.
A lot of people feel that in the Bush administration, that the Iraq War was kind of the start of that. Do you have any regrets over your role in that, or?
I absolutely think the Iraq War is an important milestone, and we went through. It was a war that it was unsuccessful wars do things to the countries that fight them. They leave behind damage, human, economic. And they leave behind a question over authority, over the actions of the authorities. I mean, all wars involve doing terrible things, but success casts a retrospective amnesty. And the things that were done to win World War I and World War II and the Civil War, a lot of the winning sides did a lot of atrocities in those things, but we cast amnesty over them because we look at the outcome and say, well, on the whole, the project was worth it. The good was done. We will leave remembering the bad to the specialists. When the war is unsuccessful, as the Iraq War was, then we all remember. You see only the atrocious cost. But I think all of us. I take a lot of responsibility for my role in American government. I wish, in a way, I wish it had been bigger. I wish it had been smaller. I'm not sure what I think about all of that, and I don't want to either. I don't want to either walk away from it or also to seem to magnify my role in it. But I would say the years from 1999 until the election of Donald Trump were a year in which people who claim to know better in the fields of finance, in the fields of war, in the fields of economics, had a series of brainwaves about how to make the country better that brought only failure. From the dot-com bust, which had such a much more lasting effect on the finances of Americans than is realized, to the Iraq War, to the collapse of the housing market, to the failure of the Obama recovery program to yield rapid results. One after another, people have seen that ideas that were sold as good for them did not deliver. And political elites, when they lose the confidence of their people, that happens for reasons.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that Trump is not smart enough to be an authoritarian. I'm hoping that he's just in it for his name. David, thank you so much for your book. It really is fantastic. It really is good. David Frum, Trumpocracy. Get this book, you guys. Thank you, Ted.